Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to our presentation. This is what to expect during your Stage 1 audit. My name is Joseph Krolikowski, and I am the QMS Program Manager for Perry Johnson Registrars. Couple of notes for everyone. All of our participants today are on mute, but we absolutely want to address any questions that you have, so please utilize the question portion of the dashboard. We will address your questions at the end of the presentation. One of the more common questions that we get is whether or not the presentation will be made available after we're finished. We do make our presentations available in two key ways. Number one, if you want to get a copy of the slides, we do make the slides available for download on our website. And if you'd like to rewatch this webinar with the voiceover, that's also available on our YouTube page, and that can be accessed also on the pjr.com website. Just look for the link entitled Previously Recorded Webinars. Now, our topics for today are going to include a discussion on why certification is done in two stages. We're going to walk you through the process, beginning with the quotation phase and how that is so important to ensuring that the audit is conducted for the appropriate amount of time and fairly. We're going to talk a little bit about what happens after you're a contracted client, but prior to the Stage 1. We'll walk you through the Stage 1 process front to back, so to speak. We'll review some of the key things that can prevent continuance to a Stage 2 audit and how you should be responding to those recommendations. And we'll conclude with your questions. So as to why things are done in two stages to achieve certification. PJR is held accountable to a number of requirements as a accredited certification body. And probably the most important of these are the requirements that are outlined in the ISO 17021 series of documents. Within ISO 17021-1, there is a section that reads as follows. The initial certification audit of a management system shall be conducted in two stages, Stage 1 and Stage 2. Now, part of the intent behind that, the logic behind that, is that only a company that is truly prepared for a certification assessment should be permitted to complete the full audit. In other words, we should have a process to kind of separate out those companies that are ready from those companies that are not ready. In terms of auditor time and expense and so forth. Now, obviously, before we can do a Stage 1 audit for you, you have to be a PJR contracted client. Now, we have a series of scope-specific applications. These are called the F1 to help facilitate that process. Now, the F1 documents are complex. Most of them run to 2 pages. But they are complex with a purpose. They're intended to gather a lot of different information. And the intent is that the more we can learn about you at the quotation phase, the better we can be competitive in terms of our quote. So the more that you tell us up front, we're going to be able to quote you better. And it's also going to help us know in advance what are some possible logistical or readiness issues. Now, we get asked all the time, where does the audit time calculation come from? How do we know how much time to assign for one contract or another? Well, there's actually a very important document that's used expressly for that purpose, and it's from the International Accreditation Forum, or IAF, and that is Mandatory Document 5. Now, Mandatory Document 5 gets into the number of days that need to be assigned for a company of a particular size. And it also covers where we can add time, or excuse me, where we should be adding time, and also potentially where we can reduce time. Now, the MD5 and every other International Accreditation Forum document is public domain. So if you want to look at it for yourself, if you go to the IAF website, which is iaf.nu, you can download MD5 and review it for yourself. Now, one of the stipulations within the MD5 that we have to operate within is that the maximum amount of audit time we can reduce is 30%. So we are always careful, if we have a client come to us and say, well, your quote is X and the competitor's quote is X minus 50%. If it's drastically different, something's wrong. Something's potentially wrong in terms of whether or not that certification body is truly operating within the rules of the industry as far as audit time. Now, once you're under contract, you will be assigned to an audit program coordinator. You will most likely refer to that person as your scheduler. Now, the intent of having a scheduler is that that person is going to manage your interfaces with Perry Johnson at all phases. They're going to be the ones to touch base with you prior to the audit, assign the auditor, follow up with you afterwards, address issues that come up during the audit, or get you over to someone who can. Now, the schedulers, obviously, they work very hard to make sure that the auditor that's assigned to you is someone who is going to work well with your team, someone who is hopefully close to you geographically, someone who is going to be competent in your technical area. Now, one of the first documents that you'll be sent after you're under contract in the lead up to your stage 1 audit is going to be a attestation of readiness. This is our F108 series of documents. Let's take a closer look at what that entails. Now, the F108 series of documents, they read like a checklist, and you're going to go through this checklist and say all of the things that you are required to have a successful stage 1 audit, that you've got all of these things. So here's a fairly complete list of what you're going to see. It's going to ask you to confirm that you've defined your scope, that you've defined what is the makeup of your quality management system, what are the exemptions that you've claimed, that you've determined what your processes are, and that you know how they interface with each other, that you have determined your process measures and that you have the performance data ready to go, that you have determined how you're going to do your internal audits. Hopefully you've either conducted the internal audit or have it planned, that you've accounted for auditor competency, that you've conducted a management review or have a plan in place for conducting one soon, that you've got your controls in place for things that are outsourced, for regulatory and statutory requirements, that all of the required documentation has been assembled. And lastly, you're going to be asked about another PJR form, and that is PJR form F191. Now, this is an optional document, but it's a useful document. We're actually going to take a couple of slides now to go over this one. Now, the F191 is actually a very long tenured document for PJR. We've been using it pretty much all the way back to the 2000 version of the standards. So about 20 years we've had this document. Now, the intent is that you've created a sufficient number of processes to fulfill all of the requirements of the applicable standards. So in other words, ISO 9001 has X number of shall statements, X number of requirements. Have you implemented enough processes to meet all of those requirements? And the idea is that you should be able to work from your processes. Typically, this is going to be taking the names from the interaction of processes document and applying the clause numbers. So let's walk through an example and show you how this is supposed to be done. So let's say that this is the interaction of processes that the organization has. Now, you may note in the lower left-hand corner that there are 6 processes. Now, those 6 processes our sales order entry, purchasing, production, shipping, quality, and support. So these are the 6 processes that have been created for this quality management system. So let's outline how these might be represented on PJR Form F-191. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, we have our 6 processes. Now, as you can note, there are some processes that impact multiple clauses, and there are going to be some processes that only impact a few clauses. So for example, I'm sure you can see that the support process literally touches on everything. And that makes sense, doesn't it? If it's support for the system at large, it's going to touch on every single clause within the standard. You may also note that clause 8.3 has no processes assigned to it. We would take that to potentially mean that this organization does not design the products that it manufactures. You may also notice that in clause 7.5, this has been identified as being applicable to every process. It's actually the only clause where that's the case. And that presumably is because clause 7.5 is where we find the documentation requirements. And it makes sense that every process within an organization would have some form of documentation, including documents or records. So this is the general idea. You should be able to outline your processes and demonstrate for us that every single clause of the standard has been accounted for in at least one of the processes. That's the intent. Now, the Stage 1 audit process, the way it's written within the 17021 standard, it's intended to be conducted on site. When we calculate audit time for you initially, we get a block of time that we are supposed to assign between the Stage 1 and the Stage 2 audit. Now, PJR does offer an off-site Stage 1 audit option, especially for simple ISO 9001 management systems. Now, the reason that I mention this is that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, if you opt for the off-site Stage 1 audit, it may mean that the total on-site audit time is going to end up being more. Now, I'd like to mention to you that we do also offer a virtual Stage 1 audit option. Now, if you're interested in that, you should definitely ask your scheduler about that being a possible option. Virtual audit time is treated as equivalent to on-site audit time if the audit is truly virtual. Now, before the auditor arrives or before the audit begins, if you're going to be doing an off-site or virtual, you should expect to be contacted by your auditor at least a few days in advance, and you should expect to receive an audit plan. Even for a simple Stage 1 audit, you should definitely expect to receive an audit plan. And it's important that you confirm that the information on the audit plan is correct and advise your auditor if it isn't, because the auditor is working, of course, from information that was provided by us, and we're working off of information that we got from you. So if something on the audit plan isn't right, we need to fix it. Now, the audit begins with an opening meeting. This is a great chance for you to ask any last-minute questions, to confirm any last-minute changes in details, make sure the auditor knows if you have any visitors coming that day or personnel availability issues, and so forth. Now, from there, the audit will proceed according to the auditor's plan. And the auditor will use the PJR Stage 1 workbook to record the results of what they're seeing. Now, just about everything that we look at in a Stage 1 audit is going to be documentation based in nature. We look at management review, we look at internal audits, we look at your performance metrics, and all of the things that we look at get one of two scores, if you will. One of two conclusions. We either conclude that the item conforms or that we have a concern. Now, a concern is understood to be anything that represents a disconnect between what you've implemented and the related requirements from the applicable standard. There are no nonconformances issued in a stage 1 audit. Now, once the auditor has completed their review of the required materials, typically they're going to need some time to prepare their report. Now, as I mentioned, there are no nonconformances issued in a stage 1 audit, only concerns. Now, once the report is finished, the auditor will conduct a closing meeting. And you're going to have one of 3 possible outcomes from the stage 1 audit. You'll be either recommended to continue to stage 2 with no concerns, which is obviously the ideal outcome. The more common outcome is continuance to stage 2 with some concerns. Or in rare cases, it may be concluded that you need to repeat your stage 1 audit. Now, you'll be asked to sign an acknowledgement of the stage 1 results, and you'll be given a copy of the completed audit report. Now, if the auditor has a plane to catch or some other time concern, it is possible that you'll have to wait a few additional days for the finished report. But in most cases, the stage 1 report can be put in your hands the same day as the audit. Now, in terms of things that can go wrong during the stage 2 audit, there are definitely some items that represent concerns, things that you need to address. One of the more prevalent of these is going to be an inadequate or inappropriate interaction of processes. So as you noticed, we look and confirm that you've identified what your processes are, that you've identified how they interface with each other. If we are shown something that represents, for example, the PDCA diagram from the standard, or something canned that doesn't really reflect on you or what your processes are, these are all potentially going to be concerns. We do actually have a webinar on just this topic. If you haven't seen it before, it's entitled The Interaction of Processes and Its Importance to a Successful Audit. Definitely something worth checking out. Understand that the interaction of processes is viewed as the single best indicator that you understand the process approach described in ISO 9001. So if that hasn't been done correctly, that raises concerns on everything else. Another item that can prevent continuance, probably the most prevalent item, is an inadequate process measure or process performance data. Now remember that ISO 9001 requires that you monitor and measure and analyze your processes. So the intent is that every process that you've identified, like in our example, there were 6 of them, should be monitored or measured, and there should be performance data available to prove that you're doing that monitoring and measurement. Now, there are some standards that have minimum requirements for the amount of data to be made available. For example, in automotive, it's required to be a year's worth of performance data. Now, for most other standards, just about any amount of data will work as long as it demonstrates that the process is implemented and effective. Now, some organizations, some of our clients choose to have just a couple of process measures, and they make the argument that these handful of measures reflect on the entire system and on all processes. And that's completely fine if that's the model that you've gone with. Couple other things that can prevent continuance: if we have an inadequate internal audit program. Now, as far as adequate, what are we looking for? Well, we're looking to see that all internal audits are planned, that you have audited all of your processes, that all of the areas that you did sample, that these are on the record. In other words, that there's evidence that the audit was conducted. Oftentimes we ask for evidence of an audit and we're given a stack of nonconformances. And we say, well, okay, but where's the rest of the audit? A stack of nonconformances in and of itself is not evidence of an internal audit. And then obviously we have to make sure that auditors are objective and not auditing their own work. Now, if you have not conducted the internal audit prior to stage 1, But you can demonstrate to us that the internal audit has been planned, that it's been booked. We can still recommend continuance to stage 2, but bear in mind, you are losing a valuable opportunity to have the internal audit reviewed prior to stage 2. The stage 1 audit is one of only 2 audits that we do where you get warnings as opposed to nonconformances. Remember that I said there are no nonconformances in a stage 1 audit. This is a perfect example of how you can use this to your benefit. If we review the internal audit records at stage 1 and we identify some things that are highly concerning, and you've got 6 weeks to go till stage 2, you've got time to fix things, and you can fix them without having to go through the burden of having to do a full formal corrective action, which, as I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a lot of steps required for that. So take advantage of this. Definitely try to have the internal audit done prior to the stage 1 audit. As I mentioned, we will also look at competency records for the internal auditors. Now, once in a while, we get asked, what's required for auditor competency? Do I have to send my auditors to auditor school or whatnot? Well, the idea is that you as the organization will define for yourself what it means to be competent to perform internal audits, just like you are defining what it means to be competent to run a machine or to answer the phone. What we're going to do as auditors is we're going to want to see proof that your auditors meet those competency requirements and that you have applied those requirements consistently. Now, there are some industries and standards where there are additional provisions that are made for auditor competency, and that's going to vary from case to case. Another item that can be a concern is the management review. The management review meeting is a very important part of the quality management system. And we're going to be looking for evidence that all of the required inputs and outputs have been addressed. Now, we have clients that prepare PowerPoint slides. That's great. That's absolutely a good way to show that you've addressed the required inputs. But PowerPoint slides in and of themselves don't necessarily represent what was discussed within the meeting, what was agreed to within the meeting. We have clients that also maintain a standardized agenda format. That's also fine. But again, remember that these meetings are supposed to be productive. You're supposed to have some tangible outputs. The standard talks about decisions and actions. What were the decisions? What were the actions? Now, in much the same way as the internal audit, bear in mind that you can proceed to stage 2 with just a plan for the management review. If we perform the stage 1 and you haven't had the management review yet, but we can see that it's been planned, we can permit you to continue. But bear in mind, once again, you lose that benefit of having us review it in a non-binding setting. We can look at it, point some things out to you, and you'll have time to fix it. If we get to stage 2 and there's issues with the management review, we have to write it up, and it becomes a formal nonconformance. So take advantage of this opportunity. Now, any conclusions that are reached in a stage 1 audit are subject to concurrence by a member of the executive committee. Now, all stage 1 audits are reviewed by our executive committee to make sure that the decisions reached are appropriate and fair. Now, if you have a stage 1 audit and you don't agree with the results, for example, if the auditor concludes that you're not ready to continue to stage 2 and you feel strongly that you are, you do have the right to issue a dispute or appeal of the auditor's decision. Now, that process is outlined in our PGR Procedure Pro 10, and if you want to get a copy of Pro 10, it's available right on our website under Registration Document Download. Now, if the recommendation is made to repeat the stage 1 audit, again, this is a rare recommendation, but we advise you to work from your audit report and shore up the issues that were raised during the stage 1 audit. Remain in contact with your auditor and with the executive committee even to discuss what you're doing and make sure that you're on the right path to a better result at the next stage 1 audit. Now, if the recommendation is to continue on to stage 2, ideally, there should be a minimum of 30 days between stage 1 and stage 2 audits, and it's better to have more like 60 or 75 days. Bear in mind, in ordinary times, PJR does have a 21-day cancellation policy related to travel. We have had many instances in our company history where clients opted to have back-to-back stage 1 and stage 2 audits, and it ended up being problematic on all fronts. We encourage you to use that time to your advantage between the stage 1 and stage 2 to work on anything that was identified as a concern during the stage 1 audit, bearing in mind that anything you don't fix is most likely going to result in a nonconformance being issued during the stage 2 audit. So in conclusion, we want our clients to feel confident and comfortable with the stage 1 audit process. It's our hope that the care taken in the pre-stage 1 phase and the mutual support of your auditor and the executive committee are going to help make this process seamless for you. We do wish you every success in your certification journey. I'd like to invite you to tune in for one of our other webinars. We have ISO 9001 2015, Knowing What to Expect to Ensure a Stress-Free Audit. This is a webinar that gets into some of the more common issues that comes up on an ISO 9001 2015 audit and tries to clear the air in terms of what we expect. As I mentioned earlier, we have our very popular interaction of processes and its importance to a successful audit. It's a deep dive on what we mean by processes and how to correctly implement this requirement. And we've got webinars on a wide variety of other topics and other standards. If you'd like to be kept informed of the latest news automatically, the best way for you to do that is to opt in, and you can do so by visiting our website at www.pjr.com. If you go to the bottom of the page, you enter your email address and click subscribe. You'll be automatically opted in for the latest news, upcoming webinars, and other points of interest. I do thank you for your time. And at this time, I'm going to go ahead and unlock the question portion of the dashboard if anybody has any questions today. Okay, we have a question from Maritza Moreno, who is asking, is the pre-certification audit considered the stage 1 audit, or are stage 1 and stage 2 both done with the final auditing company? Maritza, pre-certification, perhaps you are referring to what's called the pre-assessment audit. Pre-assessment audits are a category of audits that are performed by certification bodies like PJR. They're not officially mentioned in the ISO 17021 series of documents. Pre-assessment audits are a unique type of audit. They can only be done for uncertified clients, and they are typically done, well, not typically, they can only be done prior to a stage 1. If you've had a stage 1 already, you cannot have a pre-assessment audit afterwards. They are intended to give you a chance to have an official assessor reviewing things within your system in a non-binding fashion. So any other type of audit beyond that would potentially be a consulting type audit, which would obviously not be done by PJR or another certification body. Tim Lyons asks, in the wake of COVID-19, instead of APQP meetings being held at table, would email and other paperwork evidence suffice such as Gantt charts and meeting minutes and agenda. Tim, I think you're asking about management review meetings and not APQP meetings. But in terms of the methodology, yes, those types of alternative meetings are certainly acceptable. Ron McKinney asks, can you speak to the virtual option a bit more from COVID? Is this a more common now? Yes, Ron, certainly in our current time, we are performing significantly more virtual audits, but the stage one is uniquely positioned to be an effective option for virtual auditing. And I suspect even after the pandemic is over, we may have a number of clients who opt to continue with virtual auditing as their method for doing the stage one audit. Maxine Campbell, can the auditor leave the report with the auditee before EC review takes place? Absolutely. It is possible that the report may be tweaked after the executive committee reviews it. Obviously, if that happens, that would be shared with the client. But yes, that absolutely that's actually what should be happening. Any other questions? Okay, well, happy 4th to one and all. Thank you for your time.